Here is what James Gunn and Peter Safran should have done with the DC Universe. Hey everyone, welcome back to our movie news. This morning I saw this tweet asking, "You wake up as the head of DC Studios, what do you do?" And I have an answer that I think would unite the DC fandom and keep the DCEU, making this year's DC movies relevant to the future DC stories. So what James Gunn and Peter Safran plan on doing is a partial reboot. They seem to be keeping the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker characters and rebooting pretty much everything else. This decision has really divided the fandom, but I have an idea that fixes everything. So if I woke up as the head of DC Studios, this is what I would do. As this would be a hypothetical scenario, I'm going to say I was hired instead of James Gunn and Peter Safran. So I've had about 5 months in the job at this point. So if we go back to when I was first hired, this is what I would do. I would first of all announce that I am committed to the DCEU that has been built over the last 10 years, insisting that there is a lot of potential in this universe and that all we need is a little organization. So I would not reboot the DCEU. I'd explain to the head of Warner Bros. Discovery, David Zaslav, that the reason why the DCEU has been getting poor box office results is not the fault of this universe of characters or stories, but the lack of organization from the old regime. Since Aquaman, we have only had one movie telling the story of one of the big DC characters, and that was Wonder Woman 1984, which is seen as one of the weaker DC movies. The rest have been far less popular characters and so don't have the pull the big names like Superman and Batman have. Another factor to consider is the pandemic. The pandemic weakened even Marvel movies, but because the MCU has been so organized and have managed to build a bigger audience, their movies did better than DC's during the pandemic. Another example of how the old regime failed the DCEU. Now some would say that Batman v Superman damaged the success of the rest of the DCEU, but that can't be true as Suicide Squad and Wonder Woman both made over $700 million after Batman v Superman was released. So audiences still went and watched DCEU movies after Batman vs Superman. Others would argue Justice League 2017 was where DC lost their audience, but then how did Aquaman make $1 billion the year after it? Clearly, audiences still were going to watch DC movies. This is everything I would say to David Zaslav, explaining that the downfall of the DCEU wasn't because of a certain movie, but it was actually because the old regime abandoned their biggest hitters. And from the past 6 DC movies spread over 4 years, in which 2 of those years were affected by the pandemic, only 1 movie was about a big DC character. So with that explanation to David Zaslav, I would get to work reigniting the DCEU. No reboot, definitely no partial reboot, just working with what we have. And what we have is a lot of potential. So the first thing I would do is stay off social media, as in not interacting with rumors or toxic fans. I would purely only use social media to promote the DCEU and to see how fans react to new announcements and DC movies, but not commenting back to toxic comments, and I would only debunk rumors in the most extreme circumstances. That's not a dig at James Gunn, this is just how I would run DC Studios. But my actions with the actual DCEU movies of this year would be simple. Ensure that they all stay in line with the long-term plan. So I would start by shooting an extra scene for the Flash movie to unite the timeline. Because of the Flash's multiversal travels, it causes the main timeline to change slightly, now merging the Snyder Cut into the main DCEU and erasing Whedon's Justice League, as well as Wonder Woman 1984. These changes causes the Ayer cut of the Suicide Squad to be released, as that becomes the canon version of that story to the DCEU. So we have an organic reason to release the Ayer cut that means something to the main DC timeline. The scene I would add to The Flash would be an end credit scene where we see Barry Allen running to the Hall of Justice, which used to be Wayne Manor. In there, we would have some of the Justice League members, including Cavill's Superman and Affleck's Batman. But Batman would be accompanied by Dick Grayson, who at this point in time is Nightwing. We could possibly hear Nightwing asking to be a part of the Justice League, and Batman telling him to form his own group, teasing a potential Teen Titans storyline. We would see Barry confused, and so he goes and asks Superman who Batman is with. Clark would be confused and confirm that Bruce is with his son, and asks why Barry is asking this. But before Barry can answer, Clark stops him and says he needs to pick up Jonathan, and then flies away. Barry would be even more confused, and it would cut to the credits, now establishing that Barry's changes to the timeline has caused Bruce to have at least one son, and because this movie is set 5 years after the Snyder Cut, Clark and Lois had their child that was set up at the end of the Snyder Cut and called him Jonathan after Clark's father. So now with the Snyder Cut being canon, it also means Darkseid is on his way. But because the Flash messed with time, we're going to delay Darkseid's invasion, meaning the DCEU has a big bad to build up to, but because it's delayed, it means we have more time to explore the DC Universe. Now, if we look at Marvel, their biggest weakness right now is an oversaturation of projects and a lack of quality. DC won't be making the same mistake. This universe will take its time to tell good stories and won't release 5 projects a year. At most, 3 will be released and will most likely be 2 movies and 1 series per year, and that would include animated prequels or animated shows to help expand the DCEU's history. And so at San Diego Comic-Con, which would be around a month after The Flash would be released, we would have a DC panel explaining the DC timeline so far and what we have planned in the future. And because we won't be rebooting the DC timeline, this makes every DC movie this year matter, and also means we can announce stories for 2024 and 2025, and they will make sense because the DCEU would be continuing. There were pitches coming in for a Man of Steel 2 with Henry Cavill in late October last year, and so if I stepped in as head of DC on November 1st, then I will accept a pitch for that movie right away, and would have production start in mid-April and spanning for 6 months, with a release date scheduled for late 2024. Now, I would love to go into detail about what that movie would be like, but that would take a long time, and I want to talk about the DCEU in general. So Man of Steel 2 and Peacemaker Season 2 would be the only DCEU stories of 2024 to allow time for other projects to be worked on. Both 2024 stories would be the beginning of the DCEU's revival, and both would clearly indicate that this universe is building towards more. However, we would release the Ayer cut of Suicide Squad in 2024 in cinemas as a brand new release, and as an official confirmation that his cut of the film is canon to the DCEU. This would give the DCEU time to create more stories for 2025 and 2026, while still giving fans 3 DC stories in 2024. So technically 3 DC projects will be released in 2024. For the next 4 years, we would integrate big characters with smaller characters. So if a Batman movie comes out, we could have a smaller DC movie come out in the same year, as well as one show about another character or characters. The worst thing I think DC could do is just focus on smaller characters like they have done so for the last 4 years, and I think just telling the stories of the biggest DC characters would be a disservice to the potential of the DC universe. There just needs to be a balance so that you keep that audience engaged, but don't restrict yourself to the most famous DC characters only. Look at Marvel. They've used their biggest characters mostly between phases 1 and 3, and phase 4 was about integrating new characters into the MCU, and it hasn't really worked because their biggest characters have been missing or have been in bad movies because they focused on quantity over quality. Like I said earlier, my DCEU wouldn't make the same mistake, using both popular and unknown characters at the same time so that there is no awkward phase of losing some of your audience. But where would the DCEU be heading towards? Well, the Justice League and the Justice Society would be the main 2 groups that the DCEU would be focused on, at least at the start. We've seen the Justice League and Justice Society in action, but we need to see more of them. We would be building towards 2 Justice League movies where Darkseid invades Earth, and the Justice Society, the Teen Titans, and the Suicide Squad, and other groups and characters would be a part of them too. But that wouldn't be for another 10 years at the very least. I would also have Superman recruit Shazam to team up with him and not with the JSA, so that Superman and Shazam can take Black Adam down, setting up a storyline where their paths cross in a few years' time. Yes, we have an older cast, but with high quality movies and shows and fan favourites, that wouldn't matter, because for a lot of these characters, they've had 10 years already in this DC universe. Sure, they may have not been seen that much over those 10 years, but they are established characters. A lot of the actors look younger than their actual age as well, and if you can sign them up on long-term contracts, then you can get to work on a lot of projects over the next 10 years. And if certain actors don't want to commit to the character or need to be replaced, we can use the Flash movie as an excuse to recast those characters. And with there still being a lot of mystery to some of these characters like Wonder Woman and Batman, it means we can tell more prequel stories like how Bruce had a family in this new timeline. The main thing I want the DCEU to feel is connected. If everything feels like it's in the same universe and all heading towards the same story, you would lose a lot of the division in the fandom. There seems to be so many different factions within the DC fandom that everything is so divided, and I really don't think James Gunn's announcements have helped that. If we keep everything and put it all together in one big universe that is all working together to not only tell great individual stories, but also one big long-term story, then fans can unite and be one fandom. I've said it before, but I think DC could have either done my idea here or a full reboot. Clear the entire universe and start again. But Gunn is rebooting some of the characters and keeping the ones he created, which hasn't done the fandom or the reputation of DC any favours in my opinion. I think fixing the DCEU was a really easy thing to do, and this is how I would do it if I was the head of DC Studios. So make sure to let me know what you think of my plan to fix the DCEU in the comments below, and also let me know what you would do if you were the head of DC Studios. What I do want to say though before we end today's video is that whilst I disagree with James Gunn's and Peter Safran's DC plan, I'm still going to give them a proper chance to show off their plan. Just because I think there was a much better way of doing things doesn't mean I think they will do a terrible job, and it would be unfair for me to reject their plan without seeing what they have to offer. I actually think they will do a pretty good job. I just think the way they have announced this reboot has destroyed the hype for this year's DC films. It's clear that a lot of fans have lost interest in this year's DC films because of the reboot news, even though I am very excited for the next 3 DC films this year and really enjoyed Shazam: Fury of the Gods. And I really think doing a partial reboot where they only keep the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker characters has given a lot of fans a very good reason to be upset with their plan, but I will let their movies and shows do the talking. I just wanted to share what I would do if I was in charge of DC Studios. But that is all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe and turn on post notifications so you never miss a video. I hope to see you here again soon, so until then, have a great day. Bye!